Furosemide, also known by its trade name of Lasix, is a diuretic. Diuretics are drugs that remove water from your system or fluid from your system. Sometimes older folks will refer to their Lasix pill as their water pill because it's removing water from the system. Furosemide is more specifically classified as a loop diuretic. What does that mean? It's called a loop diuretic because of where it works, which is right here in the kidney. We're going to take a few minutes to discover how the kidney works. And at the end of this discussion, I'm going to blow your minds and explain why critical care paramedics and nurses are so darn obsessed with that Foley bag full of pee. The first thing we got to do is figure out where the loop is that the loop diuretic is going to work on. So let's zoom in on this kidney and find that loop. It's still pretty hard to see because these things are microscopically small. But right here on the border between the kidney's cortex and medulla is a structure called a nephron. And that nephron has a loop that crosses that border. And the way the nephron works is really amazing. So we're going to zoom in on that nephron and take a careful look. This amazing contraption with the funny name is your nephron. Each one of your kidneys has anywhere from 200,000 to 1.8 million of these things. That's a huge range, and nobody knows for sure why some people have so many more nephrons than others. There is research that indicates that premature infants who are still developing tend to have fewer nephrons. We do know that you are born with all the nephrons you're ever going to have. You don't grow and multiply them as you get older and develop. You have them all at birth. It's not important to me that you memorize the various parts of the nephron or you know exactly what happens at every stage here. It is important to me that you understand that there are two overall processes that are happening. The first is removal of substances from the bloodstream, and the second is recovery of the substances that got removed that we don't want to excrete, we want to hold on to. The first step of what happens in the nephron occurs right here in Bowman's capsule. This image is a cross-section of Bowman's capsule in 3D. It looks a lot more like this. The job of Bowman's capsule is to provide a rigid, confined space for the blood vessels that enter it, and we can bring those blood vessels in so you can see exactly how that works. These blood vessels are almost all arterioles. Even the ones that are bringing blood away from the nephron are still considered arterioles until they reach the end point where they become considered venules and are represented as blue in color. The arterioles enter Bowman's capsule and form a cluster of arterioles called a glomerulus. That comes from the Latin word for a bundle of thread. The glomerulus is under pressure because it's in that confined space, and that squeezes out many of the things we want to remove from the body. That process is called filtration. The larger things like red blood cells and proteins, those are too big to filter out here. They stay in the blood right where we want to keep them. Smaller substances that we still want to keep, like sodium chloride and glucose, amino acids, and water, those do get squeezed out, but we recover them later on in the process. The liquid that's squeezed out of the bloodstream in Bowman's capsule moves into the next stage, the proximal convoluted tubule. That's where about 2/3 of the recovery of the good stuff we want to keep happens. It's where 95% of the glucose gets recovered. It's also where some of the waste products that we want to get rid of are pulled out of the arterioles and collected. Things like urea, uric acid, and creatine. That process is called secretion instead of filtration. The fluid continues into the descending portion of Henle's loop. This is where about 25% of the sodium chloride, calcium, potassium, and magnesium are reabsorbed, and lots of water gets recovered at this point as well. As the fluid travels up the ascending portion of Henle's loop, a much larger percentage of sodium chloride is reabsorbed, but no water. This section of Henle's loop is not permeable to water at all. At the far end of the tube is the distal convoluted tubule, which recovers calcium and sodium. And then hydrogen ions, potassium, and ammonia are secreted from the arterioles into the distal convoluted tubule, where they continue into the renal tubule, ureters, and finally into the bladder for excretion. If that seemed complicated to you, I agree it is complicated, but it's like 1% of everything that's out there on the nephron and kidney function and how this all works. This is, in fact, an entire medical specialty, and doctors that focus on kidney function are called nephrologists. Not a coincidence. So my task is to try and make this as simple as possible to make it easy to understand. So we're going to do this. Furosemide is a loop diuretic, which means it works here in Henle's loop and also at the distal convoluted tubule. And what loop diuretics do, furosemide, bumetanide, toracimide, those are all loop diuretics, and what they do is keep more sodium and more calcium in the urine, and because there's more sodium in there, it attracts water, and you wind up excreting that water out the bladder, and that reduces the amount of fluid in the body. The second category of diuretic are thiazides. Hydrochlorothiazide is an example of a thiazide, and about 5 others that I can't even pronounce. What thiazides do is work only at the distal convoluted tubule, and they leave more sodium and chloride inside the urine, and that attracts water, and you wind up excreting all of that out through the bladder and reducing the amount of water in the body. A third category of diuretic is carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and if you've never heard of it, it's because they are rarely used in the management of cardiovascular disease. They're mostly used for glaucoma, but they work here in the proximal convoluted tubule, and they affect the amount of bicarb in the urine. And with more bicarb, it attracts water, and you wind up excreting that water. Not as effective as the other types of diuretics, but it does work. The fourth and final category of diuretic are osmotic diuretics. The most commonly used one of those is mannitol. They don't work on the nephron, they work on the vasculature around the nephron, and it changes the osmotic gradient, or the attractiveness of water into the vasculature, and it leaves the water in the nephron, and then we wind up excreting the water and getting rid of fluids that way. So those are the 4 categories of diuretics that you might encounter as a paramedic on an ambulance, and the one that we carry is the furosemide. Now that we talked so much about how diuretics affect the nephron and help us to regulate the amount of fluid in the body, you have a very decent understanding of what the nephron does. And that's good news, because you'll remember in the very beginning I promised to explain why critical care paramedics and nurses are so concerned about urine output. That is also related to the nephron, and it's right here in Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule has the glomerulus inside it, and that glomerulus is under pressure in order to squeeze out all the stuff we're trying to filter. There are 3 pressures at work here. The first one is called glomerular hydrostatic pressure, and that's a fancy way of just referring to your blood pressure at the point at which it reaches the glomerulus. You remember from EMT school, a blood pressure has a mean arterial pressure, and we try and keep it about 65 or greater in order to ensure end organ perfusion. Well, the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, or your blood pressure in the glomerulus, is about 55 millimeters of mercury. All of that pressure is pushing out from inside the glomerulus. Then there are 2 pressures that are pressing into the glomerulus. The first is called blood colloid osmotic pressure. That's about 30 millimeters of mercury. And that's just referring to all of the salts and solids and proteins and everything that's in your blood that is attracting water into the arterioles. And that osmotic pressure is pulling in while the hydrostatic pressure is pushing out. The last pressure involved is capsular hydrostatic pressure, which is the capsule squeezing on all of this stuff. And that's about 15 millimeters of mercury. And now you can do the math. You got 55 millimeters pressing out, minus 30 pressing in, minus another 15 pressing in. And so your net outward pressure is 10 millimeters of mercury. That's how much pressure all of this flow is through the nephron. Now, when the patient goes into shock and their blood pressure drops because of bad cardiac output or because of sepsis or because of hypovolemia, and that 55 millimeters drops by 10 millimeters or more, now you have no net outward pressure. It's zero. And that means there's nothing flowing through the nephron. That means the kidneys have shut down. So critical care paramedics and nurses that are giving medications to try and raise blood pressure, when we see urine output, we know that the glomerular hydrostatic pressure has risen to 55 millimeters or above in order to get that net outward flow. And that is the explanation for why urine output is a good proxy for blood pressure being perfusion level or not. Pretty cool, huh?